Today's speaker, Professor Thierry Tardy. Several other universities, including Sciences Po in Paris. He's a real expert on European security, has worked widely on both NATO and the European Union, but also the UN on peacekeeping, peace building. And now, since 4 years, he told me, he's based in Rome, where he works particularly on NATO, but still with a broad understanding of European security. And today he's talking about a very topical issue because he's dealing with NATO and the Ukraine crisis and war. So for this reason, I don't take any more time. I give you the floor, and I'm sure that we will have questions afterwards.
Well, thanks a lot. Buonasera, good afternoon, everyone. I need to start by apologizing for not being able to do that in Italian. It's a shame for me being an Italian resident for some time but not being able to speak your beautiful language, but happy to be with you for this session. I wanted to thank Professor, but she's left, so I will wait for her to come back. And so as Professor Thierry said, we're going to talk about NATO and what we need to call the war in Ukraine, and so I'm going really to focus on Ukraine, NATO's response to the war in Ukraine. I'm not going to talk much about the European Union. I'm not going to talk much about national policies, but in the exchange we can certainly look at that as well. What I would like to do is to look at four main issues. One is I'd like to give some background first on NATO's mandate in the post-Cold War era, so over the last 30 years, how has NATO's mandate and activities and raison d'etre evolved, because it's important that we spend a bit of time on this to understand how NATO has reacted to the current crisis and war. Second, I'd like to say a few words about NATO and Ukraine, specifically over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, for obvious reasons. And we will see that NATO has had with Ukraine a particular relationship over the last 30 years. Third, we're going to talk about NATO's response to the war. So 24th of February is a game changer. It's a key date, and we are going to spend some time, actually, let's say most of the time, looking at how NATO has responded to the crisis, the war as of 24th of February 2022 in some detail. So here I will be a bit technical on some of the measures, but you will see that there are also political ramifications. And fourth, I will end with you may know that NATO is going to adopt a new strategic concept at the end of next month, in June, in the summit in Madrid. And I think it's probably important that I say some words about how the current situation in Ukraine and in Europe in general will impact the forthcoming strategic concept that, as you know, is a strategic level document that will define the mandate of NATO for at least the 10 coming years. That's for the plan, and I want to start by thanking Professor Thierry for your invitation to come here. I said that, but you left, so I repeat it now. It's a pleasure to be with you for this session. So I start with my first point about some background about NATO's activity over the last 30 years. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's a kind of scene-setting exercise that matters to explain what is happening today. And I'm starting with the end of the Cold War. Well, first, I'm starting with the creation of NATO in 1949 with an ostensible collective defense mandate. NATO was created to deter and defend against one clear, massive military threat that was the Soviet Union at the time. That was very clear, and the mandate was collective defense. So NATO was an only activity organization, and that activity was collective defense. With the end of the Cold War, that mandate of NATO is being called into question, is being challenged. At the time, one was talking about an existential crisis for NATO, and the reason that had led to the creation of NATO in 1949 was no longer with us. The Soviet Union was no longer there. And the big strategic question was, what is NATO for? What is NATO going to do now that the Soviet Union is no longer there and Russia is obviously, so we are there in 1991, 1992, that Russia is not considered as a threat that it was when it was the Soviet Union. And part of the answer to that existential crisis was that NATO is going to evolve to do other things. And in that framework, collective defense, that was the mandate during the Cold War, tended to become a bit dormant. So collective defense, you've heard about Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, because Russia was no longer a threat, became a bit dormant and was somehow replaced by another important activity for NATO, but that was new, and that was crisis management. The necessity and the capacity of NATO to respond to some of the sources and manifestations of instability, first in the Western Balkans. It started in Croatia, the Adriatic Sea, and then Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then Kosovo. So we are here in the 1990s, where crisis management as an activity tended to replace collective defense that was NATO's mandate during the Cold War. So Russia was the threat, collective defense, Russia is no longer the threat, NATO does something else, and that's crisis management. Crisis management became one of the core tasks of NATO during that period. And then 2001, 9/11, the attacks in New York and Washington, NATO deployed a big, massive operation, very controversial, in Afghanistan for 20 years. That was also about crisis management. So NATO did crisis management in Europe, and then in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, but also in Libya, another very controversial operation that falls within the realm of what is called within NATO crisis management. No longer collective defense, crisis management. And then came a year that is a very important year to understand what NATO has done over the last 30 years and what NATO is doing today, and that's 2014. So 8 years ago, there were two major events that took place and that have modified significantly what I have just said in terms of NATO's mandate. And those two events are, one, the end of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, ISAF. At the end of 2014, NATO allies put an end to ISAF that had been deployed at the end of 2001 in Afghanistan. And that was considered as the end of that paradigm by which NATO was a crisis management actor. So it is true that as of 2015 until last August 2021, NATO was still in Afghanistan, so I am not minimizing this, but that operation since 2015 was no longer a combat operation. It was more capacity building, training, equipping the police and armed forces of Afghanistan, so of a different kind, of different nature. The end of ISAF as a combat operation at the end of 2014 marks the end of NATO's crisis management mandate to a large extent. So if you look at crisis management operations today, there are not many operations that fall within that that branding, crisis management. You have still an operation in Kosovo. I wonder how many of you know, while Italy is quite involved in that operation, you might be aware of the KFOR in Kosovo that still exists. You have a small mission in Baghdad, in Iraq, but that is a bit dormant for various political reasons. Then you have a maritime operation in the Mediterranean Sea, which is called Sea Guardian. And as far as crisis management is concerned, it's more or less it. The rest is different. The rest falls within a different sets of activity, which is not crisis management. That's one event, the end of ISAF in 2014. And the second event, which is important to understand what NATO has done over the last 30 years, it's the Ukraine crisis, what we call the Ukraine crisis. Now we talk about the Ukraine war, but it started in 2014, Crimea being annexed by Russia, what happened in the Donbass, and since was a game changer for NATO, for the simple reason that NATO was moving away from crisis management and embraced again the collective defense mandate that it was created for back in 1949. So you would have pieces in academic journals or in the media talking about NATO going back to basics in 2014 because Russia has come back as a threat to European security and European allies, not only Ukraine, but European states that happen to be, for most of them, NATO allies as well. So if the threat comes back, NATO needs to adapt to that new threat. And 2014 marks that key year in which NATO embraces again a collective defense, so more defense-oriented, less crisis management-oriented kind of mandate. That took the form of deployment of battle groups in Poland and the three Baltic states. Poland and the three Baltic states are the four countries, and I'm speaking here prior to the current crisis, are the four countries that were the most exposed to the Russian threat, the most concerned, and probably for good reasons, with the Russian threat. They are also the ones bordering Russia, either directly in the north or with Kaliningrad for Poland. So in the territory of those four countries were deployed what are called battle groups. That's a NATO operation. It's called the Enhanced Forward Presence, the EFP, Enhanced Forward Presence, that is still existing, obviously, and that marks the shift from crisis management to collective defense again. And in addition to the deployment of this Enhanced Forward Presence, NATO took a number of decisions to reinforce its defense posture on the eastern flank. And the SecGen, Jens Stoltenberg, is prolific in its description of the many measures that NATO has taken since 2014 to make sure that NATO adapts to the new environment, re-embrace the collective defense mandate, and becomes a genuine deterrent to Russia as a resurgent threat on the European continent. And then the last episode, and I'm just going to mention it at this stage, the last episode of that chronology is 24th of February 2022, 3 months ago, when what has happened in Ukraine and this invasion by Russian forces of Ukraine marks a kind of paroxystic point of first Russia becoming, or being, more than becoming, being a real threat to the European security order, to European states, to the sovereignty of European states, non-allies, non-NATO members, and also NATO members, and also a kind of new game changer for NATO's mandate, because the premise of embracing collective defense was 2014, but with what happened now, I'm going to go to that in more detail in a minute, is that NATO has become once again fully obsessed by collective defense and how to deter and ultimately defend against Russia if need be, meaning if Russia happened to attack one of the 30 allies of NATO. But I'll come back to that 2022 development in a minute. So that's for the chronology. It's important to understand collective defense, crisis management, and collective defense again. In political, in cultural terms, in practical operational terms, it means that NATO has changed a lot what it has been doing and what it has been for. The what for question has had different answers depending when you ask that question to the alliance. And if you look at the narrative, I work for NATO, but I'm not going to serve too much of the NATO official narrative, but the official narrative is that NATO is very good at adapting to the new environment, and the examples are the ones that I've just mentioned, and the latest example is what is happening in Ukraine. Then you may decide whether you agree with this or not. That's something that we can discuss in the Q&A. That's for my first point. Then second, I'd like to say a few words about NATO and Ukraine, because of course it's important to see a bit how the two political entities have interacted over the last 30 years. So the starting point is that, of course, with the end of the Cold War and the dismantling of the Soviet Union, Ukraine in 1991 becomes a sovereign state. There is even a referendum about this sovereignty at the end of 1991. And then on the NATO side, so I said at the same time, existential crisis, what is NATO for, right? And I said crisis management is part of the answer to this existential crisis era, but there is another way by which NATO is going to respond to the uncertainties of the early 90s, and that's enlargement. Enlargement to states that used to be under the political domination of the Soviet Union, and are no longer Eastern Europe and Southern Eastern Europe. So some of those countries are going to join NATO. I'm not going to deal too much with this. That will start in 1999, and then in different enlargement steps. But some are going to stay outside of NATO. And for those states, like Ukraine, NATO is going to create a special program called Partnership for Peace. So NATO is going to create a series of programs that target partner countries, so countries that are not members, but that are geographically or politically close to the alliance, and for which it's important to have some kind of institutional framework to have institutionalized relations. And the Partnership for Peace program is created in 1994, so relatively quickly after the end of the Cold War. And Ukraine is one of the first members, countries to join the program, together with Russia, together with Belarus, together with all the countries of Central Asia, the Caucasus countries, and the countries that are going to join NATO later, like the Baltic states, like Poland, Hungary, Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, etc., etc. But Ukraine is a member of the Partnership for Peace as of 1994, as much as Sweden and Finland, and I just mentioned them because you may have seen that those two countries may well join NATO very soon. Today, or let's say just prior to the 24th of February 2022, although it's still the case today technically, Ukraine is in the category of the most advanced countries in terms of cooperation with NATO. So it was given in 2020 the status which is called Enhanced Opportunity Partner status, which is, so there are different statuses within NATO partnership. I'm not going to enter in much detail, but Ukraine was one of the most advanced partner. There are 6 countries that are Enhanced Opportunity Partners. It's Ukraine, Australia. So I said geographically and politically close. Obviously, Australia is not geographically close, but politically. So Ukraine, Australia, Finland, Georgia, Jordan, and Sweden are 6 countries, not allies, but partner countries that are close to the alliance. In parallel, you may also have heard that back in 2008, there was a well-known NATO summit in which NATO allies pledged that Ukraine and Georgia would become at some point members of the Atlantic Alliance. That was a pledge that was made in the final communique of the summit. I'm going just to read 2 sentences of that communique. So I'm talking about the spring of 2008. NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. And then the next sentence is, we agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. That's the sentence. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO without giving any date. And at the time, there was already tensions about whether it was wise to integrate Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, given that Russia had expressed some reticence or irritation or political resistance to the idea that those two countries would join NATO. And I just opened quickly a parenthesis, and I will close it very quickly, which is that a few months after this Bucharest summit in the spring of 2008, you had the war between Russia and Georgia in August 2008, and of course the two events are not unrelated. Just a quick note on this, on the what is called the open door policy of NATO. So NATO has the so-called open door policy, by which all European states that meet a number of criteria are welcome to apply to NATO and become members. There are three criteria that are defined in Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. So to be able to become a NATO member, you need, one, to be a European state, which raises questions about whether Caucasus is in Europe or not. I'm not going to have that discussion today. Second, the state needs to be, I quote, in a position to further the principles of the treaty. So that's the kind of value-based approach of NATO. A country is welcome if it shares what we want to do in terms of political principles. And third, if that country is, I quote, in a position to contribute to the security of NATO. So not only do you have to be a European state, not only do you have to agree with us on, what brings us together in political terms, but you also need to demonstrate that you will add to the security and not add to the insecurity of the alliance. And probably we'll come back to that in the discussion, but that's an important element when looking at how far we need to go and whether we need to accept Finland and Sweden versus Georgia and Ukraine. But I'm not going to say much more on this at this stage. So on this basis, still under my point about NATO and Ukraine, there has been cooperation between NATO and Ukraine since 1994 and the Partnership for Peace, but also, and most importantly, since 2014 and the so-called Ukraine crisis. So as soon as Russia had annexed Crimea and was clearly supporting the separatist groups in the Donbass, the cooperation between NATO and Ukraine was reinforced, was strengthened. So just to give you a few examples, NATO and NATO allies, it's often difficult to distinguish between NATO as an institution and some of NATO allies, in particular the US and the UK, have been quite active. So NATO and allies have been very active in training the Ukrainian forces since 2014 and in equipping the Ukrainian forces. Similarly, there has been a NATO liaison office in Kiev that has become quite big, doing capacity building activities, training activities in support of the Ukrainian armed forces, in support of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And since we are in a European security program, you also know that there is an EU assistance mission, a CSDP civilian mission in Kiev, that was deployed a few years back in the same context. But NATO's liaison office is similar in quantitative terms, similar to the EU assistance mission. They're doing different activities, but for the same kind of in the same kind of logic. And just to say one thing about the institution where I work, the NATO Defense College, we've been doing for 20 years training of the Ukrainian armed forces through different activities, including going there every year and doing training programs for the Ukrainian Defense Academy. So just to give a few examples of what NATO has been doing in support of Ukraine over the last 20 years, but certainly since 2014, when it was very clear that Ukraine was in need of some kind of support, because there was some concern about things that would happen, and indeed things did happen. So that brings me to my third point, which is probably the most important for our conversation today, which is what NATO has done in response to what started on 24th of February. I have a series of points, like 6 or 7. So I try to be as articulate and clear as possible. I'd like to start with a point about not what NATO did, but to qualify NATO's response, because it was addressed in any kind of discussion about what NATO has done in response to 24th of February, and that's about NATO's unity or cohesion. I belong to an institution where I can tell you that prior to 24th of February, many of the debates about NATO was about NATO's lack of cohesion, lack of unity. During the Trump administration, that was very heavy. Macron talking about NATO being brain dead, diverging threat assessment exercises or priorities between the eastern flank, the so-called eastern flank, and the southern flank. You are here in a country that is very much interested in what is happening on the southern periphery of the alliance. Well, talk about this with people in Riga or in Warsaw. I'm talking here about prior to 24th of February, and you would easily realize that the threat perceptions can be very different. Diverging threat assessment and priorities and political agendas between Turkey and many other countries, including the ones, or maybe in particular the ones having a political agenda in the Mediterranean Sea, Turkey and France, maybe Turkey and Italy, and what Turkey is doing in Libya, with Egypt, in Syria, and in a few other places. So this is to say, prior to 24th of February, we would have a lot of discussions, and if I had done that talk 4 months ago, probably that problem with NATO's cohesion and diverging interests, diverging values would have been central. That's gone. That seems to be gone. I think it's fair to say that today it's gone. Today, what we see is a very strong cohesion of the 30 NATO allies. The argument being, we now have a massive threat. Nobody can deny that it is there, and nobody denies that it is there. And we have now one priority, and that priority is to deter, fight, defend against that threat, and be in support of Ukraine. That's the priority, and there is a wide consensus that that should be the priority. So the argument that 6 months ago, or a year ago, 2 years ago, the argument that was saying, wait a minute, Russia is there, but we also have Libya, we also have the Middle East, we also have some threats coming from the Sahel. That argument, I'm not saying it's no longer there, I'm saying it's very difficult to bring it to the discussion as we speak. I'm not saying it's not going to be possible to speak about this in 6 months, but today, the reality is that there is only one topic, almost only one topic on NATO's agenda, and that's Russia, and that's Ukraine, and what we should do to help Ukraine and to prevent that crisis to spill over on NATO's territory. That's my first point. In that context, I'd like to distinguish in terms of NATO's response 2 sets of activities, and that's also how NATO presents what it does. And those 2 sets of activities are the deterrence and defense agenda of NATO against Russia. The second set of activity is the support of Ukraine. But it's important not to confuse those 2 agendas, and NATO is very keen to make clear the distinction between what NATO does to defend the 30 allies, because that's what NATO is about, and what NATO allies and NATO as an institution do in support of Ukraine. Of course, the 2 are linked, but the 2 are distinct. They are linked but distinct. So let's start with the deterrence and defense agenda against Russia. So I have 4 points. First is simply the reinforcement of the eastern flank. So I mentioned 2014, Crimea and the Donbass. NATO takes a few decisions to create the enhanced forward presence. And the 4 battle groups in the 4 countries, Poland and the 3 Baltic states, and a few other measures at the time, well, that has been reinforced significantly. So those 4 existing battle groups have been significantly reinforced. by more troops being deployed. NATO allies have also decided to create 4 new battle groups in other NATO allies, namely Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. So 4 new battle groups of 1,200-ish troops that are going to be deployed in those 4 respective countries as a deterrent to Russia on the other side of the border. You've had activation of defense plans at the level of shape, which is politically speaking an important measure, the partial deployment of the NATO response force for the first time ever since its creation. NATO response force, which is a rapid reaction force, has been only used for non-strictly defense-related activities. So it was deployed, for example, to respond to the earthquake in Pakistan a few years ago. But for the first time ever, NATO response force is partially deployed. It's very high readiness. Joint task force is also deployed by France. That happens to be in the lead of that readiness force for 2022. Air and maritime assets are being deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Black Sea, and officially, I say officially because in practice it might be a bit different, but officially there are 40,000 troops that are being deployed in the eastern part of the alliance and that are placed under NATO command, which is far more than what used to be the case prior to 24th of February with the enhanced forward presence. And that also means that in practice, and it's going to be confirmed by the forthcoming NATO summit at the end of June in Madrid, it also means that there is a paradigm shift of NATO between what the enhanced forward presence 2014 meant, and I'm going to qualify this, and what NATO is doing today. What I mean by this is that in 2014, with the enhanced forward presence, the 4 battle groups that were deployed in Poland and the 3 Baltic states, the idea in military terms was tripwire. Tripwire is that wire, if you touch it, it blows up. Okay, it's a technical term that was applied to describe NATO's posture in Poland and in the Baltic states. It meant that in quantitative terms, NATO's presence was not big. It was not about deterring Russia to cross because Russia would face massive, infantry units or tanks, or it was a tripwire approach that meant we are going to deter Russia because we deploy troops, and some of them are from the US, some of them are from the UK, some of them are from France or nuclear powers, and Russia is going to be deterred to cross the border with Poland or with the 3 Baltic states for this, because of this qualitative presence, the tripwire. The shift that we are seeing is that now NATO is going to move to a real, genuine defense posture, no longer tripwire, no longer qualitative, but much more significant in numbers. So the reinforcement of the 4 battle groups in the 4 countries I mentioned, the deployment of 4 additional battle groups, and then that is my second point, the massive US comeback to Europe in political terms, but also in military terms. So in political terms, of course, the contrast is interesting between all the doubts that the Trump administration had led to in terms of the degree of commitment of the US to the defense of European allies. You may remember some unfortunate statements by Trump about Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, about NATO being obsolete and things like this. Well, with the new administration and the new situation, the American posture is clearly significantly different. And the political support by the Biden administration, the way the Congress, so both Democrats and Republicans, have been able to sign the different financial envelopes to support Ukraine, attests to a political support of the US to not only to Ukraine, but also the alliance, the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, solidarity among allies, which is arguably important. And in operational terms, the deployment of about 22,000 troops by the US, additional troops of the US in different countries of Europe, including Germany, including Poland, and a few other states of the Eastern Flank, which raises the number of US troops to Europe to 100,000. So just for you to have a sense, at the end of the Cold War, the US has a bit less than 400,000 troops in Europe. And it went down to about 50, 60,000 a few years ago. And now it's back to 100,000, which is considered to be an illustration of the political and military commitment of the US to the defense of Europe, which again, I'm going back to my point about the lack of unity, was not a given a few years ago. And when Trump was in power, there were debates about if Russia does silly things on the Eastern Flank, will the US be with us? And to that question, the answer was never very easy, including from officials of the US administration at the time. Now we seem to see, I think we can be a bit assertive, we see a situation that is politically very different. That's the second point. The third point is, I move a bit away from a NATO perspective here, but I cannot not mention the fact that European states, as states, but many of them happen to be NATO allies, have also made significant shifts in terms of defense spending, in terms of defense posture. Of course, Germany comes to mind. With the when you look at the debates during the elections, the campaigns in Germany a year ago, the color of the coalition in Berlin today, and kind of decisions that have been taken that was unthinkable a year ago, and between the pledge to spend 2% of the GDP on defense, which is a NATO pledge back in 2014, and the decision to create that special fund of 100 billion euros to reinforce the Bundeswehr, and the recent decision to move from non-lethal equipment, defensive weapons, and now offensive weapons delivered to Ukraine. You see the kind of shifts that we are seeing. Most of countries that are in the vicinity of Russia, including Sweden, Finland, not NATO allies, EU countries, have beefed up their defense budgets, in some cases significantly. The Danish decision to have the referendum on the opt-out on the 1st of June, CSDP, military defense dimension of CSDP. Just to give a few examples of things are happening. It's difficult to see and to say how this will look like in 1 year down the line. But I think it is not possible to ignore that decisions that were so unlikely, and I could also mention the use of the European Peace Facility, 3 times 500 million. I was working for the EU at the time when, it was called CBSD, Capacity Building for Security and Development. That was the concept by which the EU was looking at ways to equip the African armed forces that it was training through the EUTMs in Somalia, Central African Republic, and Mali. And at the time, the fact that the EU could spend money on equipping, that was totally heretical. It was not thinkable. And now what you see happening in Ukraine, just to give a sense of the shift that we are looking at. And then the fourth element when looking at NATO's response to the Ukraine crisis, which is probably very important to understand where NATO is, and which explains my distinction between NATO's response in the defense and deterrence side and the support to Ukraine. So that fourth point is to say that one priority for NATO while responding to what is happening is to stay away from the conflict, to avoid becoming a belligerent. That raises the issue of co-belligerence and what it means and how NATO could be dragged into a conflict. But the fact is that politically, NATO and NATO allies I would say almost unanimity. I say almost because probably there was one or two countries that would have been probably willing to drive NATO towards something a bit more coercive vis-à-vis Russia. But politically, there was unanimity to say, and to say publicly, NATO does not want to become a party to the conflict. And that explains all the debate about the refusal to participate in the no-fly zone that Zelensky has been asking for since the very beginning, because the no-fly zone would almost immediately imply a direct confrontation between NATO planes and Russian planes, with all the consequences that we may think of. And of course, the most alarmist analysts would go as far as thinking about the nuclear implications of this. But even if we leave aside the nuclear implications, even in conventional terms, a no-fly zone where NATO allies would have participated, and most likely the US, if that had been the case, would have meant US jets, fighters, and Russian fighters being confronted, and meaning one shooting the others with all the consequences, escalation that could have ensued. And that was not the plan. So European allies and the NATO allies have been adamant that they did not want to be part of the conflict. And then, of course, you have the debate whether delivering weapons does not mean being part of the conflict. I would leave that your judgment. We can, of course, discuss that, but the principled position was that it's not all conflict. It's a bit cynical to say that, but we want to stay away. And that leads me to the second issue in that fourth point, which is that because of that willingness or unwillingness to be part of conflict, or willingness to stay away, that said a lot about NATO as a military alliance. And what it says is that NATO is a military alliance that provides security guarantees to the countries that are members of the alliance, full stop. Only the countries that are members of the alliance. NATO as a military alliance does not provide security guarantees to countries that are not NATO allies. To me, it looks like a simple definition of NATO, but judging by all the debates about why is NATO not willing to, I think suggests that that clarity about what NATO is was not clear for everybody. But the fact is that only the 30 NATO allies are protected by Article 5, and the security guarantees, incidentally, the ones provided by the US, because it's, of course, the ones provided by the US that matter. That means that Ukraine might be, as I suggested in my second point, very close to NATO as a partner, and in the category of the 6 that are the closest to. Well, it's not a NATO ally. It's cynical, it's probably sad, and probably it questions a bit the value-based nature of NATO, which maybe means that NATO is clearly an interest-based organization, and maybe we should agree with this. We can discuss it. But the fact is that Ukraine is not protected by the alliance. And it is precisely because NATO makes a distinction between being a member and not being a member that Ukraine wants to be a member, that Georgia wants to be a member, that Sweden and Finland want to be a member, because they understand that being close to the alliance might not be sufficient. So it's important to make that cruel distinction between being a member and not being a member, and what it implies in terms of security guarantees. And I did not plan to talk about this now, but that would lead us to the discussion about if Sweden and Finland were joining, there would be a time, because it takes a few months between a political decision for countries to join and the actual membership. What kind of security guarantees could NATO provide? I can discuss that in the discussion. But NATO as an institution would not provide security guarantees to political entities that de jure are not members of the Atlantic Alliance. Then a parenthesis before moving to support to Ukraine on, of course, there are a lot of measures. I'm talking about NATO here, and I said in my introduction introduction, I would focus on NATO, but of course, you would also need to look at the economic dimension, sanctions. That's not NATO. And probably it's important that I say that NATO does not take sanctions. There is no, as such, NATO sanctions against Russia. You have some restrictive measures about cooperation, the NATO-Russia Council and things like this. But the sanctions, the way the 5 rounds of sanctions, the way the EU has done, do not exist for NATO. And you may know that there is one NATO ally, that only one, that has not applied neither the EU sanctions nor the US nor the UK sanctions, and that is Hungary. So yeah, so maybe Hungary has accepted the sanctions because it's a unanimity vote for sanctions, but not like all of the sanctions, but a series of them because it's legally required. It has. But politically, yes, you're right. There is an issue with Hungary, especially when looking at oil and gas imports or exports. No, the other one is Turkey. So NATO ally, not EU member. So not having a say on EU sanctions, but not implementing EU sanctions. While there are UK sanctions, there are US sanctions. Switzerland has applied some of the EU sanctions, while Turkey has not. That leads me to the second part under NATO's response, which is support of Ukraine. And so I started, I still have like 20 minutes, something like this.
And you?
Yeah. So support of Ukraine. What I did not say earlier, but what is important is all the political support dimension. So there is like I mentioned, the political unity within the alliance, but there is a strong support of not only allies, but of the Ukrainian government since the very beginning at different levels, but including from NATO. So if we were looking at the different statements, final communiques of extraordinary summits that NATO has had, defense ministerials, foreign affairs ministerials, of course, it's full of demonstrations of political support for Ukraine as a people, Ukraine as a nation, Ukraine as a sovereign state, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian president. That's obvious. You've seen that yourself in different Western media outlets, but it's important that we also mention it, and with a kind of unanimity in favor of the Ukrainian government and president that has appeared to be an extraordinary leader that maybe some observers did not think that he would appear under that light. Second, in terms of support, there has been a lot of, it's not much discussed, but a lot of support in terms of intelligence, provision of different kinds of information intelligence, coming in particular from the US, from NATO as an institution, and from other allies that have apparently helped Ukraine on a few key issues. One of the most important that was mentioned was the missile on the Moskva, the ship in the Black Sea, probably Western intelligence, and there are a few other examples, but clearly US intelligence is going to the Ukrainian government, and that's part of the support that is provided to Ukraine. And then, of course, the delivery of weapons. So I'm not going to say much here, but I think it's interesting to note the shift between non-lethal, the German debate, but not only German, and then lethal, but only defensive. So the defensive, it was only anti-tank, anti-aircraft, some artillery and some ammunition, but not much more. And now, partly since the Bucha drama, many of allies have shifted to the delivery of more, not only lethal, but offensive equipment. You may have heard that some analysts argue about the distinction between defensive and offensive I leave that to military experts, but the fact is that now there seems to be no taboo on the kind of weapons that allies are ready to deliver. There is one big question that is now increasingly raised in policy debates: is how long are we going to be able to provide those weapons, because many of them are taken from our stocks. And I was reading a piece even in the US, they have serious questions about the extent to which they are going to be able to continue to sustain the effort of delivering weapons to the Ukrainians while our own stocks are, of course, being diminished. In particular, if you are thinking in terms of the next step, that might be one of the NATO allies could be attacked, and then we would need weapons to fight Russia on another front, but with the weapons that we've given to the Ukrainians. I close that parenthesis, but you have that very practical debate, but it has political ramifications about can we, EU money being used to, EU money, I suppose you know that here is nothing else than member states' money, it's our money. It's not because it comes from the European Peace Facility that it is not coming from the European member states. And EPF is our budget, but it doesn't really matter in a particular case. So you have that debate about how long are we going to sustain the effort. But the fact is that so far, US, UK, Germany, France a bit, I must say I'm not sure how much Italy has been active on that front, but a few key NATO allies, not NATO. So the issue here is that NATO is participating in the delivery of weapons mainly through the use of NATO bases. So you have a number of NATO bases throughout Europe, and they are being used for the delivery of weapons, but for obvious reasons, NATO does not much communicate on this, because one other operational challenge is, of course, the security or the safety of the delivery of those weapons, in particular as soon as they cross the border and enter Ukrainian territory in trucks, usually at night, but they can easily, and it has happened, they can easily be targeted by Russian missiles or planes. And of course, the issue of the delivery of weapons leads us back to the question of co-belligerence. I mentioned that before. To what extent can we say we are not part of the conflict since we are heavily supporting one of the two parties through the delivery of weapons? As far as I can tell, there is no legal definition of co-belligerence, so it's a political concept that has no legal definition in terms of IHL or use at bello or use in bello. It's just a political concept. But what is important, I think, in political terms, I would say it's not much what we think about us being co-belligerent or not. It's very much about what Russians think, because as soon as they say, well, we consider you as co-belligerent, we can repeat ad nauseum that we are not. If they think we are, end of the story. And we've had statements by Russians that were hinted towards that interpretation of what we are doing through the delivery of weapons. Let me end with my fourth point about the forthcoming strategic concept. So just before I come to what's coming, the last strategic concept for NATO, 2010, Lisbon, a different world, right? Before Ukraine 2014, before the migrant crisis 2015, before the end of ISAF, before the Libya crisis 2011, before the Arab Springs. A lot of things arguably have happened since 2010. So already a year ago or 2 years ago in my institution, 2 years ago, we published a piece about is it time to revisit the strategic concept? And the author was saying at any line, yes, we need to revisit the strategic concept. So that debate has been ongoing for a while, and there is also a very unscientific approach that says that every 10 years anyway we need to to revisit any kind of strategic level documents, especially when considering that the strategic environment is evolving anyway. So that was in the air. And you had that episode of Macron saying NATO is branded, and I don't know whether you remember the context, but the context had nothing to do with NATO. It has to do with northern Syria and the Turks and the Americans and the French. But the fact is that he said that, a bit unfortunate. The allies were saying, oh, those French again. But that triggered a process within NATO, a reflection process, NATO 2030. I don't know whether you heard those. So it started to, to think and to demonstrate that the brand death was not correct, and the decision was then taken at the June 2021 summit that by June 2022 NATO would have a new strategic concept. So I'm saying this because it means that the decision was taken prior to 24th of February 2022. It was already taken. Why at the time, and there were huge tensions with Russia, with the deployment of troops at the border that had already started at the time. But we were in that context, in the context also where Stoltenberg, or NATO Secretary, was pushing a lot for NATO's agenda on climate change. I don't know whether you saw that, where the US was pushing a lot for NATO's agenda on China, with some NATO statement as of 2019 mentioning China that had never been the case before. So the 2010 strategic concept, China does not exist, it's not mentioned. And as a parenthesis, in the 2010 strategic concept, Russia is mentioned as a partner of NATO, just to add to the relevance of revisiting it. So the context was there. And of course, with 24th of February, things have changed. And it's very banal to say that. And what it means for the strategic concept is the following. First, well, the strategic concept will take stock of the new environment, which is arguably a very different security environment, with concepts such as strategic competition. And strategic competition is a term that is being used by NATO to involve both the US, the West on the one side, and China, Russia on the other side. There has been some reluctance to use the term great power competition in NATO circles for one reason, and let you decide what you think about that reason, which is that, well, we are not going to use great power competition because Russia is not a great power. So we are not going to be nice to them by using that term. Strategic competition, we can have China, we can have Russia without saying they are great powers. So strategic competition is going to be there. It's going to be central to the strategic concept, which will be very different from the strategic concept of 2020. Second, one very important issue of the forthcoming strategic concept is that it will be collective defense heavy. It will be collective defense centric. It will be centered on the concept of collective defense, meaning that the priority for NATO is going to be to deter and defend against one country, which is Russia. Back to the collective defense agenda. That will be, so I'm going to say something and then I will slightly contradict myself, but I take the risk. The strategic concept, I think, will be heavy on collective defense. Russia is the threat, and we are going to concentrate on that threat heavily for the 10 coming years. Having said that, and this is where I nuance a bit, I suppose that the strategic concept will also be mindful of not too easily overlooking other issues than Russia and the collective defense agenda. So probably the challenge will be to calibrate between there is a massive threat, it's Russia, and we are not happy with this, and this is what is going to mobilize us for. And well, there are other threats out there. And the utility of the strategic concept is to have a strategic vision, right? And the strategic vision will probably invite the NATO allies to go a bit beyond the threat constituted by Russia. So what do I mean by this? I mean, and that's my following points, that there are questions about, I don't think I said that already, but NATO has 3 core tasks. I mentioned collective defense and crisis management. There is a 3rd core task, which is cooperative security. That's the 3 legs that NATO is about: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. And I mentioned the shift between collective defense and crisis management. I did not talk much about cooperative security. Well, one question that is raised today in the context of revisiting the strategy concept is, if collective defense is central, how much space are we going to dedicate to crisis management and cooperative security? I hear, and it seems to be, that NATO allies are going to keep the 3 core tasks. There was a debate at some point that resilience might become a core task, or that cooperative security might be deleted, or I don't know, but it seems that the 3 core tasks are going to stay. And another argument is that crisis management could also become important. First, because there are still sources of instability at the southern periphery of the alliance that are still there. They have not disappeared. It's like when COVID came, the narrative was, well, COVID adds, but the other threats are still there. So it's just adding things. It's not replacing. And it's the same with the current situation. So all the different sources of instability at the southern periphery are still there. And then the 3rd argument is that, and in addition, Russia and maybe even China are increasingly active in areas at the southern periphery of the alliance where NATO used to do, or where the EU does, crisis management, and where crisis management might be useful to. So it's not really collective defense. You know, if NATO is active in the Mediterranean Sea or in Libya, although I must say it's difficult to imagine how NATO could be very active there, but it might also be driven by the necessity to contain, to deal with Russia, as Russia is increasingly active. You all have heard about Wagner in Central African Republic, in Mali. Well, NATO is not there, but if the new threat is really Russia, not only on the eastern front, but also on the south, then it might be that that NATO will have to go there. Maybe not under a collective defense hat, but maybe under a crisis management / cooperative security hat. So that's the calibration I'm talking about. Collective defense, yes, central, but crisis management, cooperative security will have to be there. Another question is China. Well, China, so if we had had that conversation 4 months ago, probably I would have said, well, China is going to be big. Probably the word threat is not going to be used to characterize China, but challenge is the word that is being used. And you may know about the EU characterization of China that NATO was also taken on board. Now there is a kind of question mark. Some countries, like France, have been reluctant to put China in NATO's agenda. I know maybe that's not for NATO to handle, maybe it's a bit far, maybe other kind of institution could deal with China, but you also know that the US is pushing for NATO to play some kind of a role. Not easy to define, but that's a question mark. And I suppose that China will be in the document. It will be described as a challenge. And when you will do your search on China, probably will appear 20 times in the strategy concept versus 0 12 years ago. And Russia will appear 27 times and China will be 18 or something like this. But it will be there. It will be on a different level, but it will be there. And then the other question, and I will end with this, whatever conclusion, but is, as you may have heard, whether we will have some new members joining the alliance at the Madrid summit. From what we hear, it's very likely. So Sweden and Finland. So first Finland, Sweden, but probably together will apply. And if I go to my 3 criteria of Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, are they Europeans? No. Yes, they are Europeans. Do they further the principles of the alliance? Probably yes. Do they contribute to the security of the alliance? Well, that's an open question. Some could say, well, not sure, because if they bring war with Russia, maybe they will not contribute to. I think that's an important debate to have. what is very clear is that the US narrative, the Allies narrative, the NATO narrative, same gen, is very positive about, of course, there will be more than welcome and it's going to be quick. So it's going to take, politically speaking, at the level of NATO, it's going to take a summit to accept them. But then, of course, NATO is an intergovernmental organization composed of 30 member states where the rule of law applies, and those states have procedures and parliaments that will have to approve the membership. So in the best case, it will take a year or 8 months to, and the question is, what do we do during those 8 months or a year when, like, politically they are members, but legally, back to Article 5 and the security guarantees that only apply to NATO member states, what is happening? So happy to take that in the Q&A if you want to have that discussion. And there is also an entire debate on how that membership will shape the alliance and the European security order, and Russia's reaction. Russians have had statements that are a bit worrying, but we start to get a bit used with those statements. But that's of course a question. Let me conclude by saying that maybe just three points that I want to make. One is 24th of February is a game changer. Of course, we've used that with 9/11 and with Crimea. So we need, as I'm an analyst, I'm a researcher, we need to be a bit prudent with, nothing is going to be the same, and we said the same with COVID. So we need to be a bit prudent, but I would tend to say, war has come back to Europe with, and I did not say anything about the massive violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes, and so that is a new situation that will be a game changer in not only the way we interact with Russia, but in the way we are thinking about security and defense on the European continent. Second, I mentioned NATO's unity, and well, as I happen to come from that institution, I think this is something that needs to be, and I would say the same for the EU unity. I think there are reasons to be, for the ones, maybe you're not in that category, but for the ones who believe in the role of international organizations, the two institutions that are NATO and the EU have delivered. Of course, nothing is perfect, but they have delivered against their mandate at a time where the situation is extremely critical. And the third point, there are a lot of uncertainties, which I did not address in my talk, but a lot of uncertainties about will unity last and how long will it last, about Russia's policy, Russia's ultimate goals, will it be confined to the Donbass and the territorial continuity with the Azov Sea and Crimea, or will it go beyond? How will Russia respond to Sweden and Finland joining NATO? And I was reading a piece in the trend coming on the impact of the Biden's policy, increasingly saying that Biden's goal is to undermine Russia on Russian reaction to that. So the kind of proxy war debate about the fact that it's indeed increasingly the US and Russia fighting through Ukraine, which was initially an argument that was brought by some of the pro-Putin supporters in the Western world, but it is increasingly a political debate between the US community. And talking about the US and unity, how long will the US commitment last? There is, when saying one threat does not replace the other, there is still the US pivot to the Indo-Pacific, and China is still there, and there is, of course, the debate about China's role in or abstention in this crisis, but the extent to which the US will continue to support not only Ukraine, but also European allies versus the US going back to the kind of pressure that Trump was putting on European states with the argument, hey, young guys, you need to spend more on defense because I'm busy elsewhere. So now the time has come for you to, which is happening, we see that, but is it going to last? And are the Europeans capable of taking over the enhanced forward presence, the new battalions that are being created? How much will Europeans be able to take over in military terms, in political terms, the defense of their continent? Article 5, of the Washington Treaty, possibly without the US. If that has to happen, I have doubts about the feasibility of this in the short run, but in the medium to longer term, of course, it's a different story. I think I'll stop here. I don't know whether I was too long or too short.
No, that was just fine, because we have a lot of meat. So first of all, thank you very much. I think you brought a lot of issues that could be explored, so we leave to the students to decide what we want to discuss about. Please.
So, I'm sorry for my voice. My question regards one of the last points you touched, and especially the fact that Russia feels threatened by some positions taken by NATO, and we see that will somehow trigger Russia to behave more heavily towards during the Ukraine crisis, or take a more strict stance against NATO. Also considering, in fact, that as you mentioned, Finland and Sweden are going to ask probably to become NATO members. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So the strategic concept, not the security concept, the strategic concept versus the strategic compass for the European Union. I think the short answer to the question would be no. I don't think that anything in terms of wording in the strategic concept could lead to a kind of, I don't know, an unintended or aggressive reaction by Russia more than what we've seen. The strategic concept will be, as I said, heavy on collective defense. That's understood. Russia knows that. It will not be about any kind of evolution of the nuclear posture of the alliance, for example. So the only example that I could find is the one that I mentioned and that you mentioned as well, is indeed if Sweden and Finland join 1,340 kilometers of border between Finland and Russia. That's one argument that was never really solid coming from the Russian side was the fact that Russia was being encircled by NATO states. If you look at the map, it's peanuts. So it's a bit, it's Norway. I don't know if you have that in mind, but Norway, there's 190 kilometers, Norway and Russia in the north. Then you have Finland, so before Finland, not NATO country. And then it's Latvia, Estonia, and a bit Lithuania, and Poland through Kaliningrad. And that's it. And then you have Turkey through the maritime border. So that is changing a bit with Finland joining. If Finland is joining, since now, as of Finland's joining, you would have a long border between Russia and a NATO state. And so Lavrov talked about, I think it was significant consequences. And that wording has been used by Putin and Lavrov and a few others, not many others, because they are basically the only two that really speak publicly about what's happening. What this will mean, it's difficult to judge. There were concerns prior to 24th of February in January that Russia would take over the island in Sweden, which is a few kilometers away from Kaliningrad. It's between the Swedish continent and Kaliningrad. I missed the name of this small island. So Sweden deployed troops on that small island where there is nothing, but it will be politically and symbolically, of course, important. Beyond that, the thing is that when I say game changer with the 24th of February, there is one debate that is a bit different than before, and that debate will allow me to answer that question, which is the debate about the plausibility of a war between Russia and NATO. Prior to 24th of February, of course, you had analysts, in particular on the Eastern Front, that would say, you know, Russia is always a threat, we cannot trust them, they can do silly things. There were studies from US, the RAND Corporation did a few studies on how quickly Russian troops could cross the border, go through Riga in 60 hours. And so that you had that debate. But basically, the majority of the security circles were saying, based on rational argument, of course, the key word is what is rational, but based on rational argument, the Russians are not stupid. I mean, we disagree on a certain number of things, but they are not stupid, and they are not going to do stupid things. That was the debate prior to 24th of February. Now, nobody can say they are not going to, because it's not rational. They are not going to cross the border with Norway. They are not going to cross the border with Finland, because the cost would be higher than the gains. And if the costs are higher than the gains, the state does not do that kind of action. That argument is no longer possible. You can still make it, but well, we don't know. We simply don't know what they are going to do. And rationality has its limits in explaining what the Russian regime has done and what it is likely to do. So if you accept that war is becoming a possibility, is become possible, then you can certainly accept that Finland becoming a member and Sweden becoming a member might not increase the security of NATO, but decrease it. It could be some of the scenarios that are studied, including in think tanks, is it's not a massive infantry armed divisions crossing the borders, but it's just a few kilometers. In Estonia, Norway, you take one town. The night between the 31st of December and 1st of January, you 10 kilometers. And then you see how NATO reacts. Are the US going to fight back in the northern part of the European continent, in Norway or in Estonia for 10 kilometers taken by the Russians? And that's a debate. Now it seems that the answer is yes, oh yes, because what is at stake is not the 10 kilometers. What is at stake is NATO, it's the European security order. So we are going to collectively fight for this. Does the certainty mean that Putin is going to be deterred by this? We are not sure. So to answer your question, it is not impossible that those two states joining NATO would have a negative effect on the security of the continent by the way of Russia trying to undermine the sovereignty of these states. It's not possible to exclude that.
Right now, by reading talking about people like on social media and also by listening to what they say, it seems to me that certain categories of people are questioning the role of NATO right now and its activities, not only regarding Russia, but generally speaking around the world. And what do you think may be the reason of this type of opinion?
When you say questioning in other parts of the world, what do you mean? What are you thinking about?
Well, I read some comments about its role in Serbia and Yugoslavia.
Yeah, okay. On that debate, I'd like to say two things in a kind of maybe a bit a blunt way. One point is, as an analyst, as a researcher, I have no problem with looking at the activities of an international organization that happens to be NATO in a critical manner. And I've worked on NATO in Afghanistan, I've worked on NATO in Libya, and I've spent some time looking at the UN, EU, and NATO in the Western Balkans. And scholars who have done that are usually very critical about what some institutions and their member states through the institutions have done. And I have no issue with that. I have also no issue with saying that part of the tensions between Russia and the West, including NATO, have to do with the way NATO has handled the enlargement. Some tensions, the Russians were never very happy with the enlargement. We proceeded on a certain number of occasions without really considering their opinion, whether we had to do that or whether we could have been wiser doing something else. We can discuss that, but I can accept that. So that's the first part of my argument, is that NATO is a political institution with a political agenda. It's a US dominated institution, and the US is not always known for having a benevolent political agenda. There are interests, and it can be quite cynical in pursuing its agenda. I think we need to recognize that. First part of my argument. But the second part of my argument is that where I would be less comfortable is to start, I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but I know that the argument exists, is to start drawing on what I've just said to conclude that, well, then Putin is not really guilty of what he's doing because, or the argument that says NATO and the West or the US are partly guilty because what they've done. This, and believe me, I'm not saying this because I happen to work for that institution, but I don't think it's a solid or sincere argument. There are tensions, but from this to conclude that one of the two entities is justified in doing what it is doing now, this I don't see how one can make that argument in a sincere or solid manner. Because with that argument, when are we going to stop making that argument? One day, Putin might use chemical weapons. He might even use a tactical nuclear weapons. And are we going still to say, well, but he was pushed by NATO? No, NATO, Russia is an aggressive imperial power that has an aggressive imperial policy. Russia has had aggressive policies and invaded most of its neighbors, has had military units deployed on the territory of Moldova, a neutral non-aligned country, on the territory of Georgia, on the territory of Ukraine. It is the policy that Russia has been conducting since the last 30 years. So whether that policy can be in one tiny way be explained by the posture or the policies of the US or the Western states, personally, I don't buy it. He has issues with the West. He has issues with the fact that Ukraine would move away from the Russian domination and would be closer to the West. That's what matters. Whether we are responsible for that, I simply don't think so.
Thank you. Others? Please. Yes.
As you previously mentioned, there are two groups of countries, the future participants of NATO. We know Sweden, Finland, and Ukraine and Georgia, as you said. So, is there some kind of issue of taking all of them and creating some kind of future group of future participants and trusting procedure?
I think this is where the ambiguity or the ambivalence, or some would say the hypocrisy of NATO's policy is. Because on the one hand, you have the open door policy, Article 10, so the three criteria that are defined in Article 10. And in principle, I quoted the Bucharest summit saying we agreed that Ukraine and Georgia are going to be in the future NATO member. That's for the principles, and in a way, the theory. And in practice, I think it's clear for everyone that 2 of the 4 countries will join and 2 of the 4 countries will not join. And actually, you might argue that if I go back to the 3 criteria, that so the 2 countries, I suppose you understood that the 2 countries that are not going to join are Ukraine and Georgia, probably because they would not match or tick the box of the 3rd criteria, which is to further the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. Because it is clear that for Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance would run the risk of undermining the security of the alliance more than it would strengthen the security of the alliance. You may make the argument that it would be the same for Sweden and Finland. It is not a given that, and I said that Sweden and Finland joining will inevitably strengthen the security of the alliance. I mean, we had that discussion a few minutes ago. But it seems that, I think it's more than it seems, that Ukraine and Georgia are more problematic than Sweden and Finland. And not only because of course, part of the official narrative, I go beyond the official narrative here, part of the official narrative says that one problem with Ukraine and Georgia is that they are so behind in terms of standards. But it's not really the issue. That's a bit convenient to say that because the real issue is political. And you may know that the reason why in Bucharest, while the US were quite in favor of those 2 countries joining, it is France and Germany that blocked it. France and Germany were thinking in terms of not irritating Russia. So the French and the German narrative at the time was maybe we don't need to irritate Russia because we know it's going to be a problem for them. And this is why that ambiguous statement was agreed upon at the Bucharest summit. In that context, the fact that Zelensky was the one saying, he said that very early in the conflict, that Ukraine would probably not join NATO anytime soon, was a kind of relief in the West, because if it comes from him, then we don't need to say, sorry, but we are not going to be able to take you in the club, because you in the club would be politically too difficult to assume in terms of the political and military implications. And it is probably the same for Georgia. So NATO is an interest-based alliance. There are issues with 2 countries that are applying, and it is probable or likely that those 2 countries will not join, but at the same time, it is likely that Sweden and Finland are going to join, probably because the cause-again analysis is more favorable when looking at Sweden and Finland than looking at Ukraine and Georgia. So NATO as an alliance and the member states probably conclude that absorbing Sweden and Finland will bring more than it can potentially cost. And that calculation is so different in the case of Ukraine and Georgia. That's the limit of the kind of liberal approach to enlargement and Western institutions. I think we need to accept this, or if not accept, at least recognize.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, has there been a change on the alliance's perspective regarding Belarus, given recent developments with the deployment of Russian troops on Belarusian territory and the referendum that sanctioned the possibility of, the deployment of nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil? Like, are Belarus and Russia now considered to be one and the same, or is there a difference?
So I'm not sure I have a totally clear answer to that, but I would tend to say that now they are considered to be in the same basket. They are considered to be co-belligerent. So Belarus is co-belligerent the way NATO sees it. If you look at what the procurer of the International Criminal Court, the cases that were also open against Belarus. So in terms of the sanctions against Russia and Belarus dating back to 2014, so all the exercises and cooperation, Belarus has been cut from all the programs. So just to give you an example, NATO Defense College used to be invited, Belarus, they are not invited, they are removed from the list of partners. So if your question is where would there be a distinction between the two, what areas, I wouldn't be able to tell you, the sovereignty of Belarus, of course, is very much questioned on the Western side. So, as you said, with the latest developments, I don't know whether there is a NATO statement, NATO as an institution statement, putting the two countries at exactly the same level. But politically, they are certainly considered as co-belligerent and part of the conflict at the same political level. Of course, in operational terms, they are a bit different, but in political terms, they are the same level.
Yes, my question is not concerning the Ukraine crisis, but more about the legitimacy of the shift from collective defense to crisis management, and especially concerning, possible which do not fall within Euro-Atlantic space. So, how have they been perceived?
So when you say legitimacy outside of Europe, you are thinking of Afghanistan, Libya, and the legitimacy of NATO operations?
Yes.
So there are two ways to respond to that question. One is the kind of politically correct question, which I will offer, and then I will offer a different type of answer. The politically correct, or the kind of official answer, is to say that legitimacy is a component of legality. And if you look at the Afghan operation or at the Libya operation, different context, but in the two cases you had UN Security Council resolutions, and in the Afghan case, consent of the host state for the presence of the international military operation, and legitimacy in international security environment comes largely from the consent of the communities, the entities with whom you work. So it was not the case in Libya, but it was the case in Afghanistan. And in the case of Libya, you may argue that the legitimacy of the operation comes from the UN Security Council Resolution 1373 of February 2011, that legalizes the operation, and by legalizing the operation, legitimizes the operation. The responsibility to protect is also a strong source of legitimacy. That's the kind of the official, because I suspect your question is more malicious than this. And indeed, beyond this official position or response, what was really questioned in those two cases, especially over time, when looking at Afghanistan, is the legitimacy of the NATO presence. So does it suffice to say, well, we have a UN Security Council resolution, or Amit Karzai, or these people have said yes? Does it suffice to justify what has happened? So not only the nation building, peace building, but the counterinsurgency, the combat operations in Afghanistan, and of course in Libya, the case is even stronger. So probably not. As a researcher, I have always believed that NATO, as a defensive Article 5 collective defense organization, should stick to its defensive collective defense Article 5 mandate and not do anything else. I think it was a tragic mistake for NATO to go to Afghanistan. NATO had nothing to do there. If states wanted to go there, states, they do what they want. But I think it, precisely because of legitimacy issues and political issues, going there has had detrimental effect on the image of NATO, the perception from there, but not only from Afghanistan, and probably even worse in the Libya case. So maybe states wanted to do something. Gaddafi was not a nice man, and we wanted to. I'm not sure that it was really grounded, but the fact that NATO was doing it, I think, was a mistake. And even if you link that debate to the relationship with Russia, if NATO had sticked to a very defensive mandate in the Euro-Atlantic area, I think it would have undermined the Russian narrative about NATO's aggressivity going here and there and there. So yes, I would agree with the less official response that says that the legitimacy of NATO's activity was questioned. And when I said 2014 was a key date for NATO because it moved away from crisis management, the debate at the time in 2014 was also, I did not, I think, pronounce that term, but intervention fatigue. The fact that states were thinking, what are we doing there? What are we achieving? What are the objectives? And what are the counterproductive effect that we are sowing in those populations? Because it was so clear. I don't think we had to wait for 2014 very quickly. We were not welcomed. And not only by the Taliban, Al-Qaeda had left, but by the local populations. And so I think that was a tragic mistake, and it explains partly the tensions I was referring to with our previous speaker. That was a mistake. And now NATO has moved back to, I think, what it should be about. And crisis management is a different debate. States can do crisis management, the EU does crisis management, the UN does crisis management. You could have coalitions of states doing crisis management. NATO, I think that was not the smartest move over the last 30 years.
I'm so very sorry because it's already time and it's just. Avete già lezione qua? So, yes, the professor is not here, so okay. Very quick one.
Yes, question, just going back to the issue of Georgia. I wanted to ask you if there is been, apart from the justified concerns, if there is going some kind of reinforcement on that front, and
sorry, on what front?
Caucasus front, from the Georgia issue, and if there are any consultations right now between Georgia and NATO.
Okay. So on the last part of your question, consultations, 2 weeks ago, the Georgian foreign minister was in Brussels, and the 6 countries that I mentioned, the enhanced opportunity partners, and EU are always in defense ministerials, foreign affairs ministerials, in summits. They are always there. So if your question is about consultations, the answer is positive. They are ongoing, not on a daily basis, but almost on a daily basis. If the underlying question is where is this going to lead Georgia, back to the way I responded to a previous question, that's a bone of contention. It's going to be difficult for Georgia and Ukraine, but the question is about Georgia to join the alliance in that current context, because there will be resistance from allies. So you may say it's sad, you may say it's cynical, but resistance from allies to accept states that could lead. Maybe I should end with that sentence, because the question is, are we ready to fight Russia for Georgia, to fight Russia for Ukraine? That's the question that is posed to parliamentarians, to policymakers, to heads of states. That's the question of co-belligerence. That's the question of the no-fly zone. Are we ready to fight Russians to defend Georgians or Ukrainians? And maybe the sad response is, no, we are not. Therefore, we close the door to that policy option that may lead us to have to fight Russia. And that risk, we seem to be willing to run for Sweden and Finland, but not willing to run for Ukraine and Georgia.
So joining, thank you, Professor. on for a long time, I guess.